helpful accessibility techniques in ETD instructions and templates. Sharing this information with you is John Fudrow, University of Pittsburgh. My name is Kristin, and I will be your moderator for the next 50 minutes. A quick reminder before we begin, during the presentation portion, participants should keep your audio muted. Please feel free to use the Zoom chat tab to ask questions, which will be addressed during discussion segment. Thank you all for joining us, and I will turn it over to John.
All right, thank you. Let me make sure I share the right screen here. That looks like it. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining me today. I know this is a rather seems comedic, I guess, in some way, and that was the intention when I originally came up with the concept for this presentation. It dawned on me that when trying to introduce accessibility to students in staff as well, and how to train them on this, it's a bit like trying to train somebody on how to prepare an artichoke. And I found myself with that charge. And trying to introduce this concept into our sometimes decades old guidelines, and then incorporate accessibility. It to me felt like having to pull up a tutorial on how to learn, to prepare something that I'd never prepared before, and also try to then teach somebody else, like as if I was doing a cooking class. So this was again where this concept of the presentation came from. And in doing that and assessing the situation at hand that a lot of us are facing, I wagered that students were already at their limits of time and energy in their studies and in their work life, their school life, and I wanted them to figure out a way to combine and document instructions, libguides, video tutorials, workshops, and formatting support services and staff training opportunities for those who would be doing the approvals, to see if I could decrease the amount of remediations needed and the overall response from the students and the guidelines and the instructions that we're providing to them. So maybe we would have, again, people who felt more confident at the end in what we were asking them to do. So first of all, who am I and why am I talking to you about this? Well, I'm the repository librarian at the University of Pittsburgh. I work in the metadata and discovery unit. Yes, we are the MAD unit, and that's something I always find a bit of a chuckle with. I'm the project manager in so many ways for D-Scholarship at Pitt, and also our other open access subject repositories, such as the Philosophy of Science Archive. But at some point along my career, the library had always been providing ETD support and also allowing ETDs to be placed within archival status within D-Scholarship at Pitt, our institutional repository. I took over the responsibility for ETD support coordination. So we have 15 graduate schools, or 14 graduate schools in our undergraduate honors college, which the BPhils or Bachelor's of Philosophy essays are also treated in the same way as ETDs by the school. They're capstone projects, and we allow them to be formatted in the same way. And I'm there to help guide the students, the staff, the faculty that are also aligned with this process to make sure that the guidelines make sense. We teach a bit about scholarly publishing and what that means in terms of, again, copyright or supplement materials, or what to think about in terms of access restrictions. But then the larger portion of that is now general document formatting. So it's a lot to take up and to try and make sure we cover, but it is something that has become part of my position. However, in my time there, since about 2018, doing ETD support services, I identified some problems right out of the gate. And first off, we were using two distinct templates. We have a LaTeX template and a Word template. Again, 15 plus years when I took it over about that, and now more than that, of documentation and instructions and tutorials and so forth that were out there in the web. And we tried to get rid of most of them. But again, there's a lot of legacy information and legacy problems that come along with that when things change. We do about 600 ETDs a year throughout those different graduate schools and 14 different graduate schools. And so an ETD in D-Scholarship, as I tried to average it out, was about 150 pages on average. But we do have some that go well beyond that and others that are quite shorter because sometimes theses aren't quite as lengthy as dissertations. As I mentioned, the undergraduate honors college, we are allowing undergraduates who are in the honors program to prepare their bachelor's of philosophy essays for the capstone projects in the same manner as an ETD. So it's an interesting idea. I've often wanted to do a study in the back end of this to see how those who did their BPhil at Pitt and then remained at Pitt for graduate school, whether that it helped them and what their affinity was for the guidelines and being prepared for the graduate program from that. However, in those fortunate graduate schools, there's 1 to 2 staff who are assigned to perform ETD reviews. One second, I just want to make sure I have, there we go. And the process is decentralized. And much like John talked about earlier in the introductory session, some of the earlier ideas of sort of decentralized approvals sounds great on paper. It gives you the autonomy to each school to perform the actions of ETD approval and dissemination of the instructions. But in that same breath, you would say that's also a problem, because trying to make sure that everything remains the same, it can be difficult, especially when you have turnover that can be rather high, depending on the schools you're dealing with, and also just the fluctuation of degree-related information. So when I looked at the templates, as I talked about earlier, I noticed that the original template that I was given when I took over the service was just a docx file. And I also noticed in some other schools around the nation when I was doing this original assessment of what might be useful, and taught myself basically at that point what I needed to do to transition that into a docx file or template file in Word, because this was one of those first steps that I took to make sure that what I'm giving the student is more useful to them, and also be able to control some of those aspects of accessibility, not really thinking of it at that time, but just falling into that as we went forward, because giving them a template file that they have saved to their hard drive sometimes will alleviate the problem of their own normal template, or the templates they have adjusted on their particular device might interfere with that docx file we would give them. So this was just, again, that way of moving forward. Now, the LaTeX file that I was also given was 2 folders of zip files, if you will, for the main structure of the LaTeX files, but also PDF guides, one with a bit more commentary in it than not, about what was going on. And so again, this was then ported over into Overleaf, as we'll talk about briefly. But there were also PDF tutorial guides that were posted onto the Provost page for graduate students. They were labeled as videos, but they were literally just PDFs. And I was also assigned to do workshops in our main Hillman library in person. But these were all limiting to me. So I decided, what could I do to make this a little bit easier for the students? We made, like I said, the .x file. It's now in the 3rd version in the last few years. Made a lot of libguides, a new ETD site, actual tutorial videos that help address the basic formatting and some more advanced techniques. We ported everything over into Overleaf and tried to update some of the PDF guides alongside that. Made more libguides about basic and advanced tips for creating your ETD. And then scheduled a minimum of 2 workshops on Zoom. This actually came more out of the pandemic side of things and not. It made it a lot easier to reach more people and not have to have them come into a main library location in person and just attend online meetings and workshops. And also reached out and did a little more outreach, if you will, to the graduate schools to allow me to enter into the classrooms of certain faculty members who were much more welcoming to that, so that I could talk to them and share this with the students in person and work with them in more particular ways for their disciplines. And I also then opened up for annual staff to do how-to sessions to teach them what they need to know about basically using the PDF reader to do their reviews, and help the students when they had a question to find those solutions for the common things they were seeing with the resources that I was provided, to, again, limit the amount of time spent going down the support chain of, well, who do I ask about this, and this is wrong, and how do I fix this? So the idea of the ETD workflow with this and how it was put forth was the student would start drafting. They would then encounter our formatting guidelines and instructions. They would do that formatting, send it to their particular school for review through the ETD administrator tool that we use. And then it would go into either ready for publication in terms of being in our institutional repository and in progress, or it might require some editing and go back through that loop. But when I was charged with adding accessibility into this, not only the instruction of accessibility, creating the templates and tutorials, but then realizing who was going to be responsible for the accessibility checking, it became a bit, to me, like watching the accessibility point float around in the ether, much like the DVD logo. And as I continued to have conversations about it, it was difficult to express to everybody involved that nobody was going to pin this down on the page and allow us to move forward. Because when I brought up, well, if it's something we can introduce to the students early on in their graduate career, will they be able to then facilitate it in what's going on? Sorry. And it became a problem because we had the accessibility mandate for 2026. Obviously, everybody's in line with this. And as I kept trying to express all of these things, the question then became who was going to be responsible for this, how we were going to facilitate this, and who was going to lead that charge. My role was mostly there to support, but I'm not an administrator in the university in terms of graduate studies. So that became a touchy point. The decentralized review and approval was also part of that problem because training staff to do accessibility remediation sounds great on paper, but they're often not tasked for that in their positions, and the support might not be there, especially, as I said, with the turnover rate that would be akin to a lot of these positions. We'd have to retrain them every year oftentimes, and that could be a problem. So I also then took into account that students may not be that familiar with accessibility. It's something they might have encountered here or there, read about it, heard about it, but how do they actually then apply it to their works? Because even the faculty members who might be involved in the process of assisting them, here accessibility is something they need to be aware of and take note of and work towards and fixing in their writing. But more often than not, the faculty members who submit to a journal, graduate students submit to a journal, you're handing off that document to somebody else who's doing the copy editing. They're taking care of the alt text. They're taking care of the formatting for them. So now we're putting it upon them to become copy editors and to be accessibility remediation experts. And I said, there's a gap there. I already know how much we've struggled to have them understand how to use the templates, how to understand the basics that we're giving them. And now we're going to add accessibility to that. That gap has just widened. So in terms of the accessibility mandate, well, I said, what are the requirements? First thing I asked that the university should be telling me, what are the minimum requirements that you're going to portray for everyone in the university, not just for ETDs, but anything coming into D scholarship at Pitt as a repository librarian. I need to be able to use those same rules for those documents as we're doing for the ETD. So I need you to say that, to stamp it so that I can move forward on this and make the rules as written. But how can we also instruct students? How do we then build that corpus of instructional materials and tutorials and integrate it into the documents as well, with that in mind? Going back to who's responsible. If it's on the approvers, that then increases the amount of time they're going to have to spend on each document as they do those checks. If it's on the libraries who host the institutional repository and provides the support, I'm one person and I have a queue of 600 documents to do remediation for, but I can't necessarily approve it until the school approves it. And that's going to create an impasse that I don't want it to have happen. So then who is, again, responsible for that editorial solutions and remediations? And that became a point of contention again. So when I brought this up, one of my solutions was create an office that does remediation for ETDs, for graduate students. And hey, I wouldn't mind helping with that, but it needs to be something focused on that instead of decentralized nature of things. Because 15 different points of contact, the numbers of graduates between the schools fluctuates every year. Some years there's 30, some years there's 3, some years there's 400 graduating or something like that in some schools. It can be daunting to say, well, how do we plan for this if we have everybody doing something a little bit different than the others? And again, because each discipline is a little bit on their own and they make their own rules for the most part, the deadlines might be different. So how do we then structure inserting that remediation check or the accessibility check with remediation if everybody has a different deadline. We already have enough trouble trying to schedule meetings between everyone and the academic institution. I don't know how we're going to schedule these sorts of reviews when everybody has a different calendar. As I mentioned, the frequent staff rollover is a common thing that we've seen, especially post-pandemic. And it always is a struggle to introduce somebody to this what seems on paper to be very succinct and very easy, but it has layers of layers upon layers, I guess, much like an onion, to stay with the cooking metaphor. So going back to the student expertise side of things, if I'm trying to add another level of formatting and rules, is this going to increase the time that they need to spend and budget into this process? But where do we tell them that? How do we express? It's in my estimation, what I would love to see happen, and this becomes much like we had information literacy as a touch point for what libraries were doing to help with academic institutions. I think we are at a position as well that scholarly publishing in general should include information literacy. How do you find information? How to use information? But then how do you structure it? How do you put it down on paper? How do you put it into a digital format that's accessible? It should be in the same breath again as that. However, that's not how we're structured. So we are often at the end point of what they're writing, especially with ETDs. And there is that, again, gap in timing. It would be great if we just taught everybody how to do good accessible documents from the start, that it would alleviate a lot of these problems at the end. And again, I've watched how students took to the templates that we were putting out, and I understand that many of them are not reading them in the same levels that I would hope they would. So adding accessibility to that, as doing it myself in certifying how to do accessible documents and remediation tasks, I understood this was going to be a really big ask. So what's my ideal setup? I would love to be able to make sure that ETD website and outreach services are a bit more buttressed going forward. Iowa State's site is amazing as well, not to throw out too many names there, I guess, but and our site's in a similar state where we have some things sort of partitioned off into different sections. I want to make it a little bit more clear why we're doing accessibility. So that will help, again, to have the students understand and engage with it. And it's not just another rule they have to follow. I don't want to make this something that they are begrudgingly doing because the university is asking me to do this. I want them to understand why it's important, and provide them with those tools and those expressions of the importance of this, so that they can just and fold it into everything they do going forward. I don't want it to just be about ETDs. I want them to be understanding of accessibility and creating a document for the future. So when they get in time to start publishing in their field, they're already ready to go. But this also then incorporates me having to reach out to the schools. Then I was going to then set up the new templates, new tutorials and integrate all this new information. And my ETD support services may increase as well if we are going to put in some of those services for accessibility remediation. Now, I say that with ideal setup to step back a second. And though this is a great metaphor for what this is about, I stand in somewhat shame, I guess, in some regard, that when I originally had this concept for what I was going to show, I wanted to have more in practice things to show. I had prepared everything. I had proposals. I had drafts ready to go. I had all the templates edited it to a place where I thought I had integrated everything. But there were a number of barriers that kept coming up. And so we are still in a holding pattern to have this released and have this updated, which I'm hoping for the end of the semester. But again, it's one of those that I don't get to cut the ribbon on these new events that happen. So one of the first things that the walls that came up, and not to go too far in the weeds on this, but it might be something you also will have these sort of conversations. So it's a good example. What we were trying to deal with was the minimum accessibility requirements. I had a discussion with our Office of Institutional Wellbeing and Engagement. The representative and I sat down, looked at the minimum requirements that are out in the world for other institutions, what they had decided upon. I had my list of things that I wanted to make sure that we were doing. And the original concept there was, well, If it's on the approvers to have this list, they'll have to check this. That's too much time. If it's on me, again, that's too much time. Their suggestion, which I am still somewhat against, we'll see what happens at the end of the semester, was that we were going to add an addendum to the deposit agreement and the scholarship and a ProQuest ETD administrator for our institutional repository to say the student has done everything in their power to check for accessibility, and they're signing off much like they do for copyright, much like they do for that this is their own work, and so on and so forth. And they have, they've anonymized the data and so on, and as we see in other agreements, and just add the accessibility side of it, and that should be okay. And I, as a person with a 17-year-old daughter, I understand when I say, hey, how's that work going? Did you do your report for your AP class? And she nods and said, absolutely. I know that that's probably not going to be the actual answer of what's happening. There's a little bit of sliding on the truth scale of where they're really at. And I just know that this is not going to be perfect. And I don't think this is going to be great for the legal side of things of who owns this problem if we just allow them to say, yes, I did this. So that's going to be an interesting result when we go forward. Now, we have some AI tools that are also coming through that they wanted to try and apply for remediation post-graduation, but I think that's also a problem for how that will exist. And I went through and tried to do a basic analysis of the outputs from our existing templates, figured out what was going wrong, and then again made proposals for what's going to happen if we continue doing what we're doing and what I can do to fix them. So I went through, overhauled a Word template, and did a complete redesign of our LaTeX template, because again, that being a almost 20-year-old template, had a lot of issues in terms of deprecated content, things that don't work with new packages, if you will. And we also had several hundred lines of code in the class file that was just made to make it look like an old document from the 70s, a print document, and function with hyperref and do all these things to make it look just like a Word document was made into a PDF. And that's why I said, we're done with this. I don't want to continue doing this. Why make it this complicated? Let's start from carte blanche, get a fresh canvas. We're repainting this. Let's go. And that's where we're kind of at. So with the Word template, what I did to try and incorporate some of the accessibility fixes, we had page upon page upon page in our preliminary sections that were, we had a title page, we had a committee page, we had a copyright page. We had all our reference links and table of contents and so forth. And I said, why can't we just put those all on one page? The information isn't that lengthy that we have to keep separating out. I know it looks great in terms of having all this great filler paper in the front of the text, but we're not printing these out much anymore. So why can't we just have the information in a nice, succinct manner? So I put everything on one page. Obviously not table of contents and list of figures and the abstract and so forth, but everything about the document and the author and the committee, I can fit on the title page. Why are we making this complicated? So that helps to reduce some of those extra problems on how we title these pages, how we describe these pages. I then went through and I used the template to basically take our guidelines and write it in the template, and made sure that there were examples for everything I'm talking about, everything we are mandating, and why they're there, and show them how to do it on the page. Because I know they're going to have a copy of the template sitting on their hard drive that they make this from, which will allow them to be able to go back and find it. So if they start editing and they deleted all the content I gave them, they'll at least have a copy there they can open up again, open up a fresh new document and say, here's the section on this. And it will obviously be linked as well from the site and from our LibGuides, but they'll at least always have those instructions. They'll never lose the instruction manual. And again, just showing them on the page, to me, is something I find really great when I see this. I am a type of person, I have a neurodivergency that allows me to, most of the time, and my partner often gripes on me about this when they're playing a video game, shall we say, and I'm just skipping all the dialogue that's telling me the tutorial dialogue and says, here's how you do this thing. And then 10 minutes later, I say, what was I supposed to do with this thing again? And that's always a fun moment. But I feel like that happens a lot with these instructions, because they are opening up, they're saying, I need to start writing, delete all of the things on the page. Those were your instructions. Sorry, you didn't read them. And so now at least they have possibly a way to be able to see how this works in a way that's actually demonstrative rather than just a rule. When we would enter into our guidelines in the previous iterations of the sites and the documents we would hand out, it was literally just a bulleted list of things they need to do, written in a way that was meant to be somebody who's basically judging like in the Olympics. Like they have to make sure they have 3 full twists. Why are they, what's that, and how are you judging that? And so this is me trying to make it, this is what you can do with captions, this is what you can do with captions for 2 different images that you're going to continue the caption, and so on and so forth, rather than just a rule. I'm going to show them how the rules applied so they can just do it. It also went through and made sure all of the headings were configured and expressed in such a way as a chapter and section and subsection throughout the document so that they knew how to use them. They're pre-configured as a style. I also started making headings that had numbering and no numbering. So they're depending on your discipline. If you don't want to have numbered sections or subsections, that's great. At least the chapter had to be numbered, and I would tell you how to do that. I would also insert figures for several different iterations. What I figured would be some with more text, some with just a plain image, if you will, or a graph, and what the alt text should be for them. And data tables, as we all know, or can be a bane of your existence in doing accessibility. If somebody took a screenshot of a table from a document they are reading, inserted it into their ETD and called it a table with no data, this was, again, a way to show them this is what a table should be. I can't give you every iteration of what a table will be in a document like that, but at least here's a base point of what a table needs to basically have and move from there. Now, in the LaTeX template, that gets a little more complicated in so many ways. I condensed the preliminary pages the same way. I streamlined the packages that we start out with, that we give them the base template for. I tried to use the most recent versions of things that everybody who writes in LaTeX, for the most part, will be using. I would try to make sure we identify those on our instructional pages, and try not to have tons and tons and tons of tutorials for packages that they can already have, README files for. I don't have to rewrite that. I just want to make sure we rewrite the tutorial for why you would do these certain things to try to increase the accessibility of your LaTeX document, which is a struggle. And I'm trying to use some of the other developments that are happening in the field to provide more accessible LaTeX documents. But again, it's something like, make sure you bookmark all your figures, make sure you bookmark your chapters and so forth. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Similarly, figures and tables, show them the alt text, show them how to place it on the page, and show the basic structures of tables, long tables, and the variations there. But I didn't want to make it too complex in the LaTeX overlay file, because again, that's something that it's not as easy to exhibit in that regard. So I'll create a PDF that you would insert into the file system, and they'll have as reference there. So that's, again, in the works, but moving forward. So as you can see, or depending on your screen size, maybe not see so well, but the old pages in the preliminary sections were these very white space heavy pages. And now I can get all of the information condensed and refined to be, here's the dissertation, here's the title, here's the author's name, here's the degrees, here's where they're graduating from, here's the degree they're graduating with, and their committee they're defending, and hey, there's copyright. Let's move forward. Now, again, these will be one-to-one. I mean, we had the final versions of them, but this was the original drafts that I started out with. So again, reduce some of that extra space, extra chances for something to go wrong. And to me, that makes it a little bit more beneficial for the student. So what else can I try to express? And what else could you maybe try to express when you start working on these instructions? The thing with text and figures and alt text with figures, but in figures in general, and a lot of you who worked with Word and very in depth, I always seem to have a problem expressing to students, because it's probably just something they do habitually as they've written their documents in the past. Is you add a figure, you want it to be in this particular section, you want to resize it so you make sure that it has text wrapping on. And that to me is, I have always tried to make sure I express, use inline with text. There are ways to do this that works. You have to do a little editing at the end, I think, with a PDF and Adobe Acrobat to set the placement, reading order, and so forth. But to just get away from that, make it in line with text. It will then be paragraph ends, figure starts, and then the caption starts, caption description, and then another paragraph starts. You don't have to worry about placement so much at that point. As long as they have the alt text and the caption is styled in a proper way that it's identifiable as that, and same with caption description, you're going to have your reading order down. There doesn't have to worry about the image floating on the page. And that reduces a lot of the problems I was seeing. Now, the other side of that is, well, that sounds great. They put the image there. They actually added alt text, but they didn't add a caption the right way because they didn't use insert caption. What can I do to help that? So again, trying to instruct them and show them what happens when you don't insert caption. You just have a line that looks like it. It's not counted as such. It doesn't get included in the list of figures or tables. And it's also not going to be read in the same way because it might be a different style that you're using for that. So again, it allows for it to be tagged. It helps you with the reference links that we also mandate for a list of figures and tables that link to those particular captions. Back to tables need to be tables. Well, how can I demonstrate that? How can I show you and express what's going on there? Really, it's more or less this saying, if you add an image of a table, yes, you can see that that's a table. You can probably read it. But if a screen reader looks at that image and there's no text there, even if you put the alt text in it, you try to annotate it, which might work, but it might not be as easy for somebody to understand and read if you just made the data table with actual cells and numbers and headings and go from there. So that's the basics of tables. But again, it's also talking about the values that you're using for any cell shading and the text changes. You might have a different text font that might not be as readable. You might have changed the font size to something that's not very readable as well. So again, there's a lot of that table section continued to grow as I encountered more problems and what students were trying to do. And this is, again, just giving them the basics of why this is useful, what it should be, and maybe a bit of variation here or there. Now, in terms of heading levels and numbering, I've always found it interesting looking at other templates and trying to gauge where we're at on this, try to explain that the logical reading order of a document and using heading levels and the numbering as such became problematic when we originally set out with headings 1 through 5. I structured them the way they told me, and they look great for the most part. But when you got to heading level 5, you were already at, well, this is chapter, or this is the subsection 1.1.2.1.1. And somebody said, I want to have heading 6, 7, and 8. And I said, I can do that. And when I looked at the number, I started to wonder, why do you want that? Because the number, in one, it's not readable. It's not, to me, easy to follow. I'm going to get lost in that large number at some point. Maybe there's a better way to approach this and try to limit the amount of heading levels that you allow them. But also just understand that a chapter is a larger container. The sections goes inside the chapter, and then you have subsections that are visualized in that way. It helps the students understand what we're talking about and why we need those heading levels. And adding the headings as styles as such in Word especially allows you to create the bookmarks in the PDF pretty easily if you have that selected. Although Word for Mac is a whole other beast, and I'm not talking about that today. So at first, when I devised this idea and I started experimenting with it in the first iteration of the template I provided, I thought maybe it's going to be a little too much. It's going to be too much information. They're not going to want to read through that because we've already given them piles and piles of documents. But like me, I think there's a lot of students who need to see it in practice. They need to see it in how it's supposed to be. So why not write your guidelines, write your guide in the template. And so far, so good. I've had a lot of good reactions from that from students when I try to talk to them. But a lot of the time I don't hear from them. And to me, that's much like when I used to do reference statistics. I said, I would love to have a day where I say, on certain aspects of what we're doing, I don't want to have any questions, because if I've given them all the information they need on this particular thing and they don't have any problems, they're not going to come and ask me any questions about that. They're going to come and ask me questions about something else. And I feel like and this is hopefully in the same realm. If I'm not getting that deluge of questions about bookmarks or deluge of questions about figures or whatever, I'm doing something right because nobody else is flagging this. I'm not getting anything at the end of the process. So this is working. I know it's not scientific, but that's how this is working in the situation we have. And it goes back to that I mentioned earlier about my daughter telling me, yeah, I didn't know about that, right? It's that I didn't read it. I didn't read the guidelines. I didn't know where to look for this. If it's on the page that they're writing in, it's in the document we're giving them. I'm hoping that they have at least maybe glanced at it, saw the heading, saw something in the table of contents that caught their eye, and they are aware of what we're trying to do. And in the past, we also had these multiple PDFs, multiple handouts, multiple things we're giving them. It avoids that necessity of having too many reference documents floating around or having a site with more documents you have to go look at, more guides you have to go look at. It's all within those the template. So again, the guidelines and LibGuides, we revised them. I'm trying to use, again, Iowa State's wonderful concept of accessibility, readability, and consistency. Those are the three I went with for mine, and went through and recategorized all the different elements that we'll be asking the students to do. I changed the language to be less about descriptive sort of rules and said, this is why we do this. Here's what you need to do here. And tried to outline if there's a place where this could be a little bit more movable rather than rigid in terms of the rule. I tried to put a little star there to help them with that. I also gave more visual examples, more short video tutorials, and have created a lot more resources to accessibility that I would hope that the university also helps with as well going forward to teach people how to do accessibility. So how's that going? Now, I mentioned not released yet, so the majority of these things I haven't put into practice. But what I've seen so far and the things I've already done, the students get it, and they like the resources that I'm providing for them. But I haven't really been able to give them direct accessibility training. I haven't been able to train staff in a way that makes them understand accessibility and be able to feel confident in doing that sort of review. And they are still very worried about the timing concerns there. And as always, what do we do with LaTeX? There are options or are ways to approach LaTeX in a way that makes sense to create accessible documents, and I'm trying my best to walk that tightrope of what we need for that. So also, the one thing we don't often talk about in a lot of these sessions, and I've brought up with our organization, is what do you have with things that aren't text? So what if a student wants to submit supplemental files that are videos or data files or excuse me, not data, like 3D models or GIS maps and things of that regard? Who's going to check that those are accessible, and how are you going to put the stamp on that to make sure that they're okay to go forward? And that's not something we've really completely got an ideation for yet. So what I can give to you in my experiences so far, and what I think you could take from this presentation, as meandering and random it might be, is make sure you provide a lot of resources to everybody you're working with. Put it out plain as day. Make sure you integrate the instructions onto the page. Put it as part of the template you're giving them, rather than something you have to go read on a page, come back to the document, trying to figure out if it's matching what you were asking them to do. If it's right there on the page, they can understand it and see it and work from there. Make sure that you clearly communicate why you're asking them to do these things. When I first came in and I read through the guidelines, I had a lot of like, but why? But why this, and why this, and why this measurement, and why this rule? Nobody had an answer as to why. So now I'm trying to make sure we have a why for every aspect. So if anybody asks, we can say, here's why, and here's why it's important. Also, keep it simple. Try not to use too many technical language words, if you will, to describe what's going on. Yes, we like to say things like remediation, but that might not make much sense to students who don't know what accessibility remediation is and things of that nature. Also, never mention field codes in terms of words, because nobody understands what that is unless they've done it. At the same time, ask the students what they think. Ask the faculty members what they think. Ask the advisors what they think. And don't be afraid to reach out for people who are already doing things in the university that can help with this. Find allies along the university. Find allies within the graduate schools that can help you work forward and lessen the load. So I think I'm right about it, 10 minutes till, so it's not too bad. Are there any questions? And I should say, you can see what we are doing with ETDs at etd.pitt.edu. I didn't put a link in there, but that is the basis of where we're going with our tutorials, where you get the templates and so forth.
So while we're waiting on the questions, just wanting to bring up a couple of things that came up in the chat. It seems like this experience of having students who say they followed the rules and read the requirements, but actually did not is not an isolated experience. That seems to be happening in a few different places. Um, Same with the screenshot of the table. I get that too pretty regularly. Okay, Diana from University of Michigan, it sounds like you've got a question about first level headings.
I do. Should I ask it orally, or do you want me to text
Sure.
chat?
Well, I'm going to ask it. We'll see what maybe I know, maybe I don't.
So Rob and I are here from our Scholar Space, and we help with dissertation formatting. And we've used a template like yours. We're so happy to see that someone is on a parallel path. We've recently been reminded that getting the headers in order is one thing. Having more than one H1 in a document is something else. And of course, our template uses H1 for the chapter titles, and we're trying to we're trying to change that because our accessibility people say, yeah, really, there needs to only be one H1. There shouldn't be a title case. You're nodding and I can see you rolling and hemming and hawing, and we had a similar reaction, but we are trying to change the template, and I'm curious about your feelings.
So my feeling on that, and I could be wrong, and nobody has told me no from the accessibility side at my university, because they don't have this, and not to speak out of school, but they don't have this encoded in such a way that they have a rule for this. My reading of that H1 rule that a lot of people take from it was more about web accessibility, and web accessibility in terms of websites. And that's how I always have read that. It's about the H1 on a website, and there's a structure there that makes more sense for how navigation goes. But in terms of a document, I don't think, to me, an H1 is not problematic for tagging, because for the most part, if you're using some other sort of title tag, like for our list of figures, list of tables, it still gets to the same level you need to if you set up those styles properly, that they're still in logical reading order and they're tagged in the same level that they need to be. So nobody said no to this to me yet, and I could be completely wrong, but to me, it feels more logical to have the headings H1, H2, H3, H4, H5 be chapter, section, subsection, subsection, and so forth. So if that needs to change, we'll change that, and that's an easy fix with the way the template's aligned. But to me, that always felt like a mistranslation of how it was originally set up for WCAG versus PDFA. So maybe I'm wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I'm happy to hear you say that. We have I think we also run into the question then where if we're helping people do two kinds of work, make websites and make documents, then we're sort of teaching them to behave in different ways, and that just gets it more confusing for them. And I mean, I used to teach high school, and I like the idea that, an outline form has nested titles. But I'm trying to wrap my head around teaching one way that works for all more than the way I'm used to. But I appreciate that.
Sure.
So we've still got a good 7 minutes before the end of this session. I think there's plenty of time for more questions. Go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself or type in the chat. We do have a comment from Ed Fox. Interesting comment about chapter titles. One problem that our AI object detectors have not solved is identifying each of the chapters in an electronic thesis and dissertation. So that is interesting. It seems they may not be looking at the tags.
Yeah, and I guess I get back to that way. I think about like the things like the preliminary sections, like I mentioned, but they have headings for those pages, and I need to make sure they're expressed. And to me, that's a heading one. And again, maybe I'm completely wrong, and I'm reading through I was kind of glancing at the link that was shared, and I might be completely wrong on that. But to me, logically speaking, those should all be H1s, and there should be another tag that facilitates the larger title tag, if you will, or for the whole document. So I might have to go and reconfigure things as I read through more of that, but it seems like an odd way to approach that. And I know it's maybe the AI might have issues, but there's ways to train and maybe make adjustments to how that works going forward. So
yeah. And John, just to clarify, I shared that link, and it does conclude that chapter titles get the H1 tag for PDFs. They say, a PDF is not a website, and it doesn't make sense to have the H1 for the document title in that context. So I think that, and that's from the PDF Association, they give a very good explanation for why.
I feel like I've read that page before, but that was where I went from it. And I know there's always contention. But that's, again, it goes back to, we have rules that are similar for slightly different things. And you're using similar terminology, but it's not really the same in how it's applied. And I think that's the problem where we get into these, even with guidelines that we put out and try to write them, and what we're talking about doesn't always go one-to-one, especially between LaTeX and Word. So how do you make sure you have this right, is to step back and ask, why are we calling it this, and what does it need to do, and then work from there, rather than just use what you see on the paper right out of the box. So yeah, great question.
Yeah, Rob Pettigrew, thanks for sharing that link to the guide to Word for dissertations. That's out of the University of Michigan. So I will probably be downloading that in about 1 minute.
Yeah, and I've used that before, and they have a great site too. So yeah.
Nice. And then Diana, go ahead, share your other thought about motivating students.
One other thought. Your section on motivating students, of course, so hard. This idea: are they going to just sign off? And in my consultations, even though they're over Zoom, I do see a sparkle in students, candidates, I'll call them, eyes, when I say, it's not just about the screen reader, it's about your work being discoverable going forward by machines. The screen reader isn't the only machine that's using these accessible details. And when I kind of give them that, you do want the data in your table to be readable, don't you? Then they are a little more self-motivated, I think. We all have self-interest, and the self-interest of, you want to be discovered, then you need to be accessible to machines, not just to quote unquote screen readers. I feel a little bad about that, to downplay the communities of users who need these options, but it's also about the machines. And students react to that, to me.
Absolutely.
So we have another link in the chat from Wendy Robertson, and that's from section 508.gov. So that is coming straight from the US government, saying the opposite, that H1 is the heading title and H2 is chapter titles. So let's just acknowledge that this is a unresolved topic.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. I've seen 508 too, and it's one of those, to me, I always take it with a grain of salt. That I'm not going to try and get too political, but there's sometimes that I think the government websites they make a good suggestion, but it's sometimes not always in practice how it really works, and things are amendable. So I'll keep that under consideration as we move forward with our accessibility crew. But again, it feels like that's born out of the website analogy more than it is a document. So yeah. Well, I think we're almost to 5:30 here. Yeah, goodness.
So the next breakout session is going to be session 5 in the main room is going to be Vireo 4 and more, maturing an open source ETD management system and its community. And in the breakout room, session 6 will be enhancing ETD topic modeling, a framework integrating LLMs for improved digital library discovery. So hopefully you'll stay on for one of those. And thank you so much, John. And thank you everyone for coming.